there, welcome back. Today we are jumping into the disclosures that you will need to include when you write a listing to market a property for sale. So you want to communicate with your sellers that the seller is required to provide certain disclosures when they list the property so that any interested buyer can view those disclosures and the buyer has received the information that the seller knows about the property. So there are a few disclosures that are required. That would be the radon disclosure, the lead-based paint disclosure, and the residential real property disclosure. Those three are required by the state of Illinois. Now at Keller Williams Marquis, we also have a square footage disclosure. So I'm going to hop into those documents and go through them with you so that you can feel like you're educated on the documents that you need to include with your listings. So first we have here the brochure that the state of Illinois provides in regard to radon. This brochure here is purposed to inform the seller about what radon is, why it needs to be tested for, or why it needs to be disclosed. So basically, radon is a colorless, odorless gas that emits from bedrock. It is highly prevalent in areas that have limestone. And so, of course, in the Mississippi Valley here, we have quite a bit of limestone. And so radon is seen in higher concentrations in our area. So this brochure, again, would inform you and your seller of the importance of testing for radon. So you do need to provide this brochure to your sellers. This is available through IllinoisRealtors.com. It's also available on our office documents, so you can find these brochures there. So the other brochure that you need to provide to your seller is this Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. Now, if the home was built prior to 1978, then the seller is required to do that lead-based paint disclosure, and you need to provide this document or this brochure to your seller. I also do provide it to sellers of homes built after 1978, and the reason is because industrial paint, commercial grade paint, they often do have lead in them. And you know, some people take things home from the work site, they utilize those products in their home. So it's possible, even though the house was built after 1978, for there to be the presence of lead. It's possible for it to be present on the property. So I always include this brochure anyway. This document is available through IllinoisRealtors.com. It's on our office documents, and it's also available through GGAR. So you will need, again, to provide this document to your sellers. I'm just going to flip through real quick. It identifies all kinds of ways that lead-based paint could be present, how to take care of it, different resources if you have questions. So it is a little bit of a lengthy document. So now we are here at our disclosure of information and acknowledgement of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. So with this document, you want to put the property address on the top line here. The seller would initial both A and B. They need to check a box. Either they know that lead-based paint is present or they have no knowledge. And then B, either they have provided the purchaser with the available records or they have no records. So typically, the seller would check mark the seller has no knowledge and then the seller has no records. Most people haven't had their home tested for lead. However, if they have, then that documentation needs to be presented. So if these top boxes are checked, then the seller does need to provide that information. So again, the sellers would initial in these boxes here. If there's one seller, just one box on each line. If there's two sellers, then each box would need to be initialed. You, as the agent, need to initial this paragraph F, and that states that you have had this discussion with the seller and you've made the seller aware of their obligations according to the state of Illinois. the seller signs and dates, and then you as their agent sign and date. So that's the lead-based paint disclosure. Now we're going to move down to the radon disclosure. This one has the property address at the bottom. So you want to fill in that property address. Some people have had their home tested for radon. Some people have had their home already mitigated for radon. So you need to have that discussion with your seller. If they've never had it tested, they have no knowledge, they have no records, they can initial C and D, or sometimes they just initial D. Either is fine. If they've had it tested, if they're aware of elevated radon, they need to initial that A and B, and they need to provide those records to you so you can upload them with the disclosures. Those elevated levels that have not been remedied have to be disclosed. Again, if they have no records, or if it's been remedied and there is no longer radon concerns in the home, they can initial C and D. You as the agent initial this paragraph here, paragraph G, and then the seller signs and dates, and then you as their agent sign and date. And that completes the radon disclosure. Then we get down to the residential real property disclosure report. So this again is required by the state of Illinois. You as the agent can fill in the property address, you could fill in the city, state, and zip, and you can fill in the seller's name. Beyond that, it is the seller's responsibility to complete the rest of this form. So the seller needs to put the date in. When they go down, the seller needs to answer these questions. So you cannot answer these questions for the seller. And if this document is being filled out electronically, it has to be traced back to the seller, not to you as the agent. So you can't even have a conversation with the seller and fill in these boxes. The seller has to fill in these boxes. If you need help populating these boxes for your seller to complete for electronic documents, and you're not sure how to do that, see Kate or Kristen or myself or your coach, and one of us can help instruct you in how to do that. But if you're face-to-face, just hand your seller the form and explain to them you have to answer all of these questions honestly and correctly, and I can't answer them for you. Now, what I usually say to my client is, if you have a question about the question, I can help you, but I can't tell you how to answer the question. So again, the seller would go through and answer all of these questions on their own. The top one says the seller has resided in the property for the last year or the last 12 months. If that's yes, they mark yes. They do not need to provide an explanation for that. If that's no, maybe they haven't lived there for whatever reason, they still are required to answer these questions honestly. So even though they haven't lived there, they may be aware that the basement leaks. They may be aware of a plumbing issue. If they are aware of that defect, they still have to disclose it. It doesn't matter if they haven't lived there. So legally, they are required to answer these questions according to the knowledge that they have, whether they have lived there or not. So they answer these questions. If any of these questions, 2 through 23, are answered yes, then the seller needs to provide an explanation here. Now, many times they might ask, what am I supposed to write? So again, you cannot answer those questions for your seller. So, but you can instruct them. So say that number 2, I am aware of flooding or recurring leakage problems. You can instruct them to say, okay, you've answered yes to question number 2. So in these lines, you need to put number 2 and then write the explanation. For instance, or for example, maybe, what is the situation with the water in your basement? And your seller might say, well, when it rains really hard, water seeps in. Okay, that's what you need to write. See, so you're not telling them what to write, but you can help them by asking those questions to have them explain to you what the situation is. And then your words are just, okay, that explanation is what you need to write. Okay? Again, that cannot come out of our mouths. It has to be their words. Seller would sign here, date here. If there's two sellers, the other one would sign and date. Of course, buyer signatures aren't a thing yet, so we don't have those lines completed. And then you go on down. Some agents do populate this form to have them initial each page. That's not requirement. However, on page 4, it says date provided to buyer. Now, obviously, this form is not being provided to the buyer when the seller is signing them at the listing appointment or electronically preparing for the listing. However, the seller does need to go ahead and sign that they are providing this form for a buyer's review. So you get the seller's signatures on page 4 when they sign this document. What happens later is when a buyer comes, then the buyer's agent is going to fill in this date. And a lot of times buyer's agents will add their buyer's initials or signature here, verifying that the buyer has seen this disclosure. Okay, so our last disclosure with the listing agreement is the square footage measurement. So this is an extra disclosure just to protect Keller Williams Marquis and yourself as the listing agent against any lawsuit that may arise out of a discrepancy in the amount of square footage in the house. So you put the address of the property here, and then the seller would sign. Seller's printed name here. If there's two sellers, the seller signs. Seller's printed name here. And that's all that's required on this last disclosure. If you have any questions, of course, you know who to call. We are all here for you. That's it for today.